Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. I've been on a bit of a quest to find the best 32-inch 4K high-refresh gaming monitor, and so far I've come up a little bit short. Both the Gigabyte Aorus FI32U and the Asus ROG Swift PG32UQ retail for around the $1,000 mark, but on both occasions I've felt the performance hasn't quite lived up to their high price tag. It's not that these displays are bad, it's more just that they aren't quite as good as I would hope for a high-end product. So today I'm hoping MSI has the solution with their Optix MPG321UR-QD. And yes, MSI just do not learn with monitor names. MPG321UR-QD, seriously? Anyway, moving past the name, this is a 32-inch 4K 144Hz IPS monitor with features like HDR 600 support and variable refresh rates through G-Sync compatibility and AMD FreeSync Premium Pro. Spec-wise, it's most similar to the PG32UQ that we've reviewed previously, including its use of quantum dot technology, hence QD in the name. MSI are targeting the same $1,000 US price point as other monitors of this type, so it's largely going to come down to a battle of performance and features to see which option comes out on top. Availability begins this month, or so I've been told. The design is a fairly typical affair for MSI. They tend to go more towards the gamer end of the spectrum, and the MPG321 is no exception. From the front, the display looks fairly normal, and the stand section uses a squarish base. However, on the rear, you'll find a gamer-inspired design with a small bit of RGB LED lighting, angular patterns, and different finishes for each section. I don't think this looks particularly bad or anything, but as always, I personally prefer more sleek and understated designs. The materials MSI are using are fairly average for a high-end monitor. Almost all of the external surfaces are covered with plastic, so unfortunately you don't get any nice metal legs. It's a boring, basic plastic too, so it would have been nice to see MSI include something a bit more premium on a high-priced display. That said, the stand is quite functional, offering height and swivel adjustment, and the sturdiness is okay, all things considered. It's a reasonably thick monitor though, so probably not the best for wall mounting. I'm glad to see MSI include HDMI 2.1 here, which is basically a requirement on a 4K monitor these days, as it allows for the full 144Hz on both the HDMI and DisplayPort inputs. In this case, MSI offers one DisplayPort, two HDMI 2.1 ports, and a USB Type-C that supports DP alt mode and 15 watts of power delivery. In good news for those wanting to know the HDMI 2.1 specs, these are full 48 gigabits per second ports. On top of this, MSI is strengthening the feature set by offering a KVM switch, allowing you to use one keyboard and mouse across multiple input devices through a simple button press. Gigabyte first started introducing this feature on their monitors, and I think it's a good addition here given Gigabyte's direct competitor offers it too. This complements MSI's strong set of OSD features, which also include auto brightness, cheat crosshairs, shadow boosting modes, low blue light, and more, all accessible through a directional toggle. For response time performance, MSI only offers 3 overdrive settings, which is on the lean side for a high-end display. The first mode is normal, which gives us overdrive disabled, and as expected, the IPS panel here isn't that fast, offering a 14 millisecond average grey-to-grey experience. That's not fast enough for true 144Hz, so let's move up to the fast mode. Here performance is still fairly weak, only delivering a 10.38 millisecond grey-to-grey average. Cumulative deviation has improved a bit, so the monitor is somewhat clearer in this mode than in normal, but in practice the monitor isn't tuned that well, so slight blur trails are common, especially for darker fall times. With very little overshoot, there is still performance to eke out, so let's explore the fastest mode. This is a decent performance uplift with cumulative deviation now 100 points better, giving us a clearer overall image at virtually no cost to overshoot. Response times have improved to 6.6 milliseconds on average, which is decent compared to prior modes, and this is the most usable setting for 144Hz gaming. Motion clarity still isn't spectacular though, with UFO tests revealing performance between the Asus PG32UQ and Gigabyte FI32U at the highest refresh rate. One of the big issues with the MPG321 is the lack of variable overdrive. When using the fastest mode, performance degrades at lower refresh rates to the point where overshoot and inverse ghosting is quite noticeable around 100 Hz. Anything lower than that reveals very significant bright trails behind moving objects, so unfortunately the fastest mode is not suitable for gaming at 60 Hz, which might be common for a 4K monitor. Conversely, the fast mode is not sufficiently fast enough at 144Hz, but does perform better at lower refresh rates. Overshoot can be a little noticeable at 60Hz, and the cumulative deviation level isn't great, but fast is reasonably inverse ghosting free at other refresh rates, so it's the better choice for lower refresh rate gaming. Unfortunately, this means the MPG321 does not offer a single overdrive mode experience, which is poor on a high-end monitor costing $1,000. MSI really should have spent the time to introduce variable overdrive, especially as a lot of games will run more in the lower refresh range on a 4K monitor with today's hardware. We're already seeing some of the same issues as the Asus PG32UQ, which uses a similar panel, so let's see some more in-depth comparisons. As seen in the previous UFO test we showed, the performance of the MPG321UR-QD sits between the PG32UQ and FI32U. The FI32U in its highest refresh rate mode offers response time performance a few milliseconds quicker, but at the cost of overshoot. Meanwhile, it's the reverse with the PG32UQ, being a few milliseconds slower, but with lower overshoot. In these optimal conditions, the MSI monitor isn't bad, being comparable to the LG 27GN950, but it's not exactly the fastest IPS monitor on the market today, especially in the high-end segment. Certainly gaming at 144Hz is the most favorable condition for this display and has the least motion blur. Where this MSI monitor suffers is in average performance across the refresh range. Without variable overdrive, the MPG321 needs to be turned down to the fast mode for adaptive sync to prevent significant overshoot, which costs it a higher spot in this chart. A 10 millisecond average response is quite weak, worse than the PG32UQ, though the FI32 is hardly much better and also suffers from issues stemming from a lack of variable overdrive. Just on that occasion, it's too much inverse ghosting. This continues the trend of all 32-inch 4K 144Hz monitors I've tested so far having middling response time performance on average. What you get from a monitor such as the Gigabyte M28U at 28 inches or the LG 27GN950 at 27 inches is superior in general, which is disappointing for the larger panel size, which so far hasn't been able to match the performance of other IPS displays, and this can be noticeable at some refresh rates. This is illustrated well by cumulative deviation, where the MPG321UR really doesn't offer a great experience on average, as either the top end or bottom end of the refresh range has to suffer. Even with variable overdrive, I don't think the panel is good enough to move into the top tier of IPS displays, which offer results more in the 500 to 600 range. Unfortunately, the MSI monitor is closer to last generation 27-inch 4K panels than it is to the newer refresh of 4K at that same 27-inch size. At a fixed 120Hz, the MSI model isn't too bad in comparison to other 4K offerings, though it's not significantly better than the PG32UQ. Nothing much to get excited about. Then at 60Hz, this is where performance is the most unimpressive in my opinion. The MPG321 is better suited to high refresh rate gaming in general. Input lag is fine. The MPG packs a processing delay below 1 millisecond in both its 144Hz and 60Hz modes, so most of the input lag you'll experience is related to its mid-range refresh rate. One option to consider at this sort of price tag for a more responsive experience is to get something 240Hz, though you'll have to sacrifice panel size and resolution. Power consumption is similar to the Asus PG32UQ, strengthening my theory that both monitors use the same AU Optronics panel. The power consumption of this panel is similar to others of the same size and specifications, so nothing to be concerned about. MSI do include backlight strobing with this panel, and it's MSI's first iteration of strobing and adaptive sync simultaneously through a feature they call MPRT sync. It works at refresh rates between 80 and 144Hz, so unfortunately no 60Hz strobing is possible. There's also no ability to control strobe timing or length, so it's a what you see is what you get situation. In terms of overall clarity, MPRT sync works to an average degree. It's quite similar to the PG32UQ. As the panel doesn't use a KSF phosphor backlight, there's no red fringing like you get on the Gigabyte FI32U, so that's a good thing, and generally the clarity of each image is better on the MSI model. However, there's noticeable strobe crosstalk which causes multiple images on the screen. The panel simply isn't fast enough to keep up with the strict response time requirements for strobing, which doesn't make this mode particularly usable. While the MPG321 doesn't have the most amazing motion performance, it does make up for that to some extent in terms of color quality. This monitor has an extremely wide color gamut, stretching to 95% of the DCI-P3 color space, 98% in the HDR mode, and 100% of Adobe RGB, leading to a huge 85% coverage of Rec 2020. This makes this display one of the widest gamut monitors I've ever tested, giving excellent coverage of 3 gamuts, which is useful for content creation and consumption. Factory calibration is okay. My unit was decent in its default configuration, though not perfect, which led to okay grayscale delta E's. The big issue is the unclamped gamut, which causes severe oversaturation when viewing standard Rec 709 or sRGB content like YouTube videos. This monitor does have the sunburn effect, where natural skin tones are shifted into the red zone, which is not great for everyday usage. Compared to other monitors, default grayscale performance is mid-tier, but default color checker performance is bad due to this oversaturation issue. However, all is not lost, as MSI offer not just an sRGB mode, but modes for Adobe RGB and Display P3 as well. This gives the MPG321 the best control over its color space at a hardware level of any 32-inch 4K gaming monitor I've tested so far. The sRGB mode doesn't make any great progress to addressing color temperature or gamma, but it's not too bad in that area, and its gamut clamping is highly effective and reduces oversaturation significantly. Accuracy is quite good, with a delta E2000 in the 2 to 3 range on average. The Adobe RGB and Display P3 modes are both pretty good as well, and would be well suited to color accurate work in conjunction with an ICC profile. This combination of a hardware gamut calibration and a full calibration is often the most effective, so it's great to see MSI including these additional hardware modes. I think it significantly improves the flexibility of this display and makes it the best monitor I've seen so far for gaming and content creation dual use. After a full calibration, the display performs exceptionally well, and like I said, I think the gamut coverage here is good enough for accurate use across 3 color spaces. This is also true of the Asus PG32UQ, and not at all true of the Gigabyte FI32U, but I feel the additional hardware modes push the MSI model into the best category. SDR brightness is strong at 400 nits peak, easily sufficient for most use cases, especially combined with the anti-glare coating. Unfortunately, minimum brightness after calibration was quite high at 130 nits, so it's not the most suitable monitor for use in dark rooms where you don't want white sections blasting out your eyeballs. Contrast is typical of an IPS monitor, falling around the 1000 to 1 mark. That's acceptable, as you don't really want contrast to fall below that level, and it's similar to the PG32UQ. However, overall the contrast ratio is poor, given VA panels can do at least double, and this is one area I'd really like to see improve in the future with IPS type monitors, if that's even possible. Viewing angles and uniformity are both good. There's not a whole lot to say here. My unit had acceptable IPS glow, though of course this can vary a bit between units. It's not the absolute most even panel I've ever seen, but it's sufficient for most use cases. The MPG321UR-QD is semi-HDR compliant with an HDR 600 rating. It can achieve 600 nits of brightness and clearly has a wide color gamut. However, it fails to reach full HDR status due to its limited amount of dimming zones. MSI officially lists 8 dimming zones. I think this might be an error, as I see more like 16 zones, but either way this isn't sufficient for true HDR and is only going to give an HDR-like experience in a small range of conditions. The big issue with edge-lit dimming is that each zone is an entire column of the display, so when something needs to be illuminated in the center, the entire backlight from top to bottom needs to light up. This causes massive amounts of blooming in practice, and at times, if all zones are enabled, the experience isn't really HDR at all. This is compounded by MSI's choice to use a slow backlight algorithm, which smooths out backlight changes over several seconds, which isn't exactly ideal for gaming. Brightness is pretty good. The MPG321 can sustain nearly 700 nits in a full white window, slightly higher than the PG32UQ. However, at a 10% window, the MSI model can only hit 673 nits, which is well below the best HDR monitors on the market today. Brightness versus window size is relatively flat and not too different between peak and sustained, which is a good thing. Unfortunately, in our best case single frame contrast test, the results for the MPG321 are weak. While the backlight can fully switch off when displaying an entirely black image, if any part of the screen is illuminated, black levels are capped to a non-zero value even in dark areas. This limits the contrast to just 14,000 to 1, slightly below what the PG32UQ can do. This is not sufficient for true HDR, which really should see dark areas fully switched off when local dimming is utilized. And in a worst case test, the MPG321 is exposed as not really an HDR monitor at all, with only native contrast possible between a dark and bright area close together. This sort of performance is atrocious for HDR, so I wouldn't buy this display expecting great things in the HDR mode. Overall, the MSI MPG321UR-QD is another 32-inch 4K 144Hz monitor that I feel is one or two notches below where it should be for a high-end $1,000 gaming monitor. Much like the Asus PG32UQ, it's not necessarily a bad display. An MSI model has quite a few strengths that could make it the best of this display type that I've reviewed so far, but I would still find it hard to drop so much money on it when performance is middling in some areas. Like the PG32UQ, the main takeaway from motion testing is that the panel used here simply isn't that fast. Response times are largely last generation, and while the MPG321 isn't that bad at high refresh rates, a lack of variable overdrive really hurts performance across the refresh range. 27-inch 4K panels have quite a bit better motion performance than any of the 32-inch variants I've tested. I was hoping the MPG321 or the PG32UQ would address this and give us top-end IPS speed at this size, but they just don't. Again, it's not so much that you're getting a super blurry experience, in some cases you aren't, it's more that it doesn't perform as well as other high-end IPS gaming monitors of today. MSI have tried their best to make up for this in other ways though, and this is where the MPG321 in particular shines. The color gamut on offer here is huge, 85% of Rec 2020, which gives it excellent coverage of sRGB, P3 and Adobe RGB. Combined with hardware modes for all three gamuts, the MPG321 is extremely versatile and it is a great choice for use as both a gaming and productivity/content creation monitor. MSI are also offering a KVM switch, auto brightness, HDMI 2.1 at 48 gigabits per second, and MPRT sync, which allows backlight strobing and variable refresh rate simultaneously. That's a strong feature set, so it's disappointing the panel isn't a bit faster, which would have made this monitor a killer high-end product. This puts this display in the weird position where I think it's probably the best 32-inch 4K 144Hz monitor I've tested so far, but I also don't think it's worth $1,000 and I wouldn't recommend it at that price. At most, I feel there's about $800 worth of value here, which is more in line with Gigabyte's lower cost M32U, which itself should probably be a bit cheaper. The quest for the perfect 32-inch 4K monitor continues, though I'm starting to think it won't be possible with the types of panels that are on the market today. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you're interested in supporting our monitor testing and getting access to things like our ICC profiles that we create through our calibration process and all sorts of other stuff, we've got Discord chat, monthly live streams, behind the scenes videos, all sorts of great stuff, then please consider signing up to Floatplane or Patreon. Links are in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.